Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Susan Green. I'm the editor of the Colorado Independent. This is the second of what we plan to be a monthly series of events about issues that matter in Colorado. And this, some of you in the audience are people who read us and have supported us, and I just want to say thank you to you. And some of you, I think, don't know who we are at all and can't hear me, and so I'm raising my voice. So we are at www.coloradoindependent.com, and that should be the place you go every morning for your news. So we're here tonight to talk about one of the weightiest policy issues in Colorado, the death penalty. Colorado is a state that grapples with the death penalty far more than it actually practices it. This month, and for a long time to come, in the next month or two at least, a man named Edward Montour is in trial facing the possible death sentence. In May, Governor John Hickenlooper granted a temporary reprieve to convicted killer Nathan Dunlap 3 months before he was scheduled for execution. A bill to repeal the death penalty gained traction at the State House last year and then suddenly died in committee with an agreement by most parties and a pledge that there would be a statewide conversation on the issue. And that happened, I think, a year ago in 2 weeks. It's almost a year. So we are pleased to have a conversation. We hope there are many more conversations about this very important topic. And I feel really honored to have these 4 panelists who have all very personal and strong feelings on the topic. So I'm just quickly going to go down the line just and read little bios about each of you, and then I'll have you talk, if that's okay. This guy, Bob Audeby, is the father of Eric Audeby, a corrections officer at Lyman Correctional Facility, who in 2002 was killed one morning working the breakfast shift in the kitchen. The man accused in that murder, Edward Montour, currently is on trial in the 18th Judicial District, which is seeking a death penalty sentence. Bob has spent 14 years trying to understand what happened to Eric and why. During that time, his support of capital punishment ended. In December, Bob met personally with Edward Montour, an experience he'll no doubt describe today. Bob has been in court himself, fighting recently to testify at Mr. Montour's trial against a death sentence. Next to him, the guy who looks like a politician, Dave Young, is the newly elected district attorney in Adams and Broomfield counties, where he's responsible for prosecuting 3,700 felony and 34,000 misdemeanor criminal cases each year. Dave began his career as a prosecutor more than 20 years ago as a deputy district attorney with the 4th Judicial District for El Paso and Teller counties, where he prosecuted high-profile murder cases. He's prosecuted 3 capital cases. He says one of them changed his views about the death penalty, and I know he'll talk about that tonight. Next to Dave, we have State Representative Rhonda Fields, who is serving her 2nd term in the House of Representatives, in the legislature. She entered politics after working as a victims' rights advocate in the wake of the 2005 murders of her son, Javon Marshall Fields, and his fiancée, Vivian Wolf. The defendants, the co-defendants in the case, Robert Ray and Sir Mario Owens, are 2 of the 3 men currently serving on death row in Colorado. Last year, Representative Fields fought an effort to repeal Colorado's death penalty, calling the bill an insult to crime victims. And next to her, we have at the end of the table Derek Samuelson, who is a defense attorney from Fort Collins who worked for years as a public defender, did work for years as a public defender. He's tried one death penalty case, the case of David Bueno. 17 months after Bueno's conviction, and correct me if I'm wrong here, okay? For killing a fellow prisoner at the Lyman Correctional Facility, the same facility where Eric Ottoby died. It was revealed that prosecutors had withheld bombshell evidence, including a threatening letter and the killing of another inmate, the fact that another inmate was killed in the same prison unit 2 days later. At the time of Bueno's trial in 2008, prosecutors had handed over 31,006 pages of evidence. A year and a half later, 65,429 were disclosed, meaning more evidence had come forward in the 17 months since Bueno's conviction than before he was tried, and only in large part because the judge presiding over his co-defendant's trial ordered it. That case raised questions about whether prosecutors play by the rules when seeking the death penalty. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to ask you to go down the line and each of you speak for about 5 or 6 minutes about what you want people to know about your experience with the death penalty. Please.
Well, as Susan said, my name is Bob Ottoby. This thing started for me 11 and a half years ago when my son was killed, and it literally rocked my world. I was living the American dream, had 2 wonderful children, life was good, and the future looked bright, and then we get the call that my son was assaulted at Lyman Correctional Facility. And my gut reaction was immediately hate and revenge. That's the first thing that came to my mind. And so when the DA asked how we felt about the death penalty, I said, well, sure, this sounds like a perfect case. And so the trial began, and I started seeing things that I didn't think were involved in justice. There's a lot more involved in my son's death than just Edward Montour, and none of that has been brought to light. And so while he was convicted and sentenced to death, and then it was overturned, and so there was numerous appeals and numerous delays. And then John Topolnicki called me and said, Bob, we got bad news. We're going back to square one. And I says, John, I'm done. I says, I can't deal with this anymore. It's taking too big a toll on my family, on my personal life, and I prefer you didn't contact me anymore. And I had gone sour on the judicial system. I seen it, and it didn't really work. It didn't work in my son's case. And I don't believe that justice will ever be served in my son's case. I'm lucky enough that I was able to forgive Montour, and that was the biggest relief in my entire life. I thought I was just better since my son's death, but I think I may be better in my whole life, this is the best I've been in my whole life, because I see a purpose in what I'm doing, and I see an opportunity to make something positive out of my son's death. And so I'm going to continue moving forward, and not just the death penalty against Montour. You can't pick and choose which death penalties you're for and you're against. You know, you're either for it or against it. I'm against it. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Dave Young. I'm not a politician. I'm a prosecutor who was forced into being a politician so I could be the district attorney. But thank you for that compliment nonetheless. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before I get into the death penalty. When I graduated from law school, I actually wanted to be a public defender. And I went and interviewed with David Vella at the time and went through the whole interview process. Part of that process involved taking an exam. Literally right after I got done taking finals in law school, so it wasn't a lot of fun. But I took the exam, continued with the interview, and David Vella looked me in the eye and said, wouldn't you be better off being a prosecutor? And so I thought, I'm not getting that job. But I still didn't have any intentions of being a prosecutor. I kind of stumbled into the job where I went to a bar luncheon down in Colorado Springs, and happened sitting next to the table to John Suthers, who was the elected DA in Colorado Springs at the time. One thing led to another. He offered me a job. So I became a prosecutor thinking, I'm going to do this for a little while, and then I'm going to go out in private practice and make some serious money. So I was opposed to the death penalty when I came into being a prosecutor, just because of the way my background was and my experience wanting to be a public defender. It wasn't until April of 1997 where my opinion had changed. I had been on homicides for about 2 or 3 years before April of 1997. I went out to homicide scenes. I've helped investigate homicides. I've taken homicides to trial. The thought never entered my mind the pursuit of the death penalty on any of these homicide cases. That all changed in April of 1997 when J.C. Galinsky was kidnapped, brutally raped, and murdered by George Wolt and Lucas Salmon. I remember I got the call that night from a sergeant with the police department. His name was Rod Walker. He called me and said, Dave, I think this is a death penalty case. And I, of course, said, yeah, right. It wasn't until I went out to the scene and saw the nude body of J.C. Galinsky laying underneath a van in an elementary school parking lot, and I heard the confessions that were coming in from George Wolt and Lucas Salmon as to what they did to her, that I thought, justice is the maximum penalty in this case. And in the state of Colorado, the maximum penalty happened to be the death penalty. And the circumstances of that case were completely different from any circumstances of any other murder cases that I had prosecuted and tried prior to that. And so my opinion changed on the death penalty. And in fact, we pursued the death penalty in those cases. Both those cases went to trial. It took an enormous long time to go to trial. Each trial lasted 3 months, partly because of the publicity of the case. It took us a month to pick a jury on the case because of the publicity and the death penalty aspect of it. George Wolt received the death sentence from a 3-judge panel. Lucas Salmon received the life sentence from a 3-judge panel. The death sentence was later reversed by a U.S. Supreme Court case called Ring v. Arizona, and both of those individuals are now serving life in prison. I prosecuted another death penalty case, very similar circumstances, where a 14-year-old girl was snatched from the streets of Colorado Springs, taken to the mountains, and brutally raped over a period of 3 days, and then brutally murdered. These 2 individuals duct-taped her, hog-tied her. They put her in a cold mountain stream and stuck their boot on her head until she drowned. And I even hate talking to you people about the facts of these type of cases, because these type of cases are different. They're different than your normal, if there is such thing as a normal first-degree murder case. They're different. They're more aggravated, and that's why there's a need to have a more aggravated sentence, and that's the death penalty in the state of Colorado. I can get into the details of how the death penalty works, but the delay, in my opinion, in death penalty cases is not because of the prosecution seeking a death sentence. It's because the defense is giving every due process right available. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because when you're seeking the maximum penalty, the defense should have every due process right available. And that's why it takes so long. That's why we litigate 450 motions. It's as much as 600 motions in a lifespan of 2 to 3 years. Just to kind of distinguish between the 2 types of cases, your, again, average murder case, for the lack of a better word, usually goes to trial within a year to a year and a half of when the murder is committed. In our death penalty cases, it's usually double that. And then the trials are usually longer, especially when you have to pick a jury and you have to death qualify them. That takes some time to make sure you get a jury panel who's capable of giving that sentence. In Colorado, again, we have a death penalty statute. The people have decided that we need a death penalty statute in Colorado. And until the people decide we do not need a death penalty statute in Colorado, I'm going to pursue that when it's warranted, because it's the maximum penalty in the Colorado statutes. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I first want to thank Colorado Independent for putting this panel together. Thank you. I also want to thank the leadership of this church for providing the opportunity for us to talk about this subject. And I want to say that this subject is not an easy subject to talk about. This is a very dark topic. I also want to I just want to express my condolences to you for the loss of your son. I understand what it's like as a parent to lose a child. I understand what it's like every day to have to protect your heart, because I know it must have a hole in it, because you know that someone's missing. A little bit about me and who I am. State Representative Rhonda Fields. I represent House District 42, which is in Aurora. It's the north side of Aurora. And I'm in my second term as an elected official, and I came to elected office due to the crimes that were committed against my son. My son, Javad Marshall Fields, had just graduated from Colorado State University with a degree in rhetoric and speech communication. His goal was to go on to law school and to work in Washington, D.C., perhaps be a lobbyist for the government. He saw his best friend get murdered. And when he saw his best friend get murdered, he cooperated with the police. He told the police what he saw. He told the police what he heard. Ultimately, they showed the pictures of potential lineups of people who may have committed this crime. And he said, that's the guy. That's the guy. So with that identification as a witness, because that's how we solve crimes, is through witness testimony. And so with that, they were able to apprehend 3 defendants. 2 of them are sitting on death row right now. So it was only because of the aggressive police work by the Aurora Police Department and the prosecuting attorneys, the DAs in the 18th Judicial District, that I was able to seek justice on behalf of my son and his fiancée. Haven't talked much about Vivian, but want to mention her as well, because Vivian Wolf was in the car with my son when he was murdered. So it was a double homicide. She too was a recent graduate from Colorado State University, and she had a degree in nutrition. They recently had announced their love for each other, and they had announced their engagement, and they were due to be married. Because of their murders, I will not see the children that would be birthed from this union. I will never have the opportunity to see my son grow into a mature young man. His life was taken away from him because someone was trying to get away with murder. So my son was murdered because the people did not want to go to jail. So to silence his testimony, they killed my son and his fiancée to avoid him pointing him out in a court of law that he was the guy that he saw shoot his best friend. I can tell you that I'm not for death. I'm for life. I really don't like talking about the death penalty. And I didn't, like you, I wasn't someone that promoted the death penalty. It was only after going through the course of 3 trials. There were 3 defendants. They all had their own separate trials. I went through all 3 of those trials, but before we could litigate my son's case, we had to litigate the murder that my son witnessed. So before I could get justice for my son, I had to sit through the trial that my son was supposed to be the key witness for. So I attended that trial as well, because I know that my son was no longer there to speak what he saw. So I had to be his voice and his presence in the courtroom. We sat through that trial for Robert Ray and Samario Owens. They were found guilty for murdering my son's best friend. And for that crime, they were given life without parole. So we got justice for my son's best friend. Then it came time for us to try the death of Javad and Vivian. And I was contacted by the DA's office, and they said that the merits and the elements of this case could make it eligible for the death penalty. And they explained to me how the state of Colorado has special, what I want to say, safeguards in place, because not all cases are considered death penalty eligible. So we're not like Texas or some of the other states that might have, 150 people on death row. In the state of Colorado, we only have 3. And out of the 3 people that are on death row, 2 of them are on death row for murdering my son. And that's because he was a witness. And if you go around killing witnesses, and that creates a higher element of law, it's like killing a judge, or, there's other components to it, and you're going to have to explain how it works. But they explained to me, at this point, they are the people that killed Javad and Vivian are already serving life in jail without parole. So if we go through trial, do you give someone the sentence of life on top of life? And for me, I raised my son. I taught him everything that he knew: how to wash, how to cook, clean, how to take care of himself, how to save money. So it was very personal to me that someone would just kind of take his life away so suddenly like that, when I felt like he had so much promise. I felt like his life was worth something. And so for me to pursue a duplicate sentence that the defendants were, or the offenders were already convicted of, to me it felt like it was devaluing the life of Javad and Vivian. So I agreed to the death penalty for Javad's and Vivian case. And I supported it. And not only did I support it, the proceedings were in front of a jury of his peers about the neighborhood that he was raised and educated in. And that jury came back with a guilty verdict. Not once, 2 separate trials, twice, one for Samario Owens, one for Robert Ray. Each time, the jury came back with guilty. Then you go to a penalties phase, and then the judge has different explorations or rules that he gives, instructions. And then after that, they explain, this is difficult. It's difficult to get 12 people to agree. I'm down at the state capitol. I can tell you how hard it is to get consensus building. And when you think about a jury that could come together and unanimously all come back, not just once, but twice, after hearing the testimony that says that these folks should get the maximum penalty that the state has to offer is death penalty, then I agree with what the juries came back with that verdict, because I support our criminal justice system. And in the state of Colorado, we do have the death penalty as an option that's available. And the jury came back with that verdict.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Derek Samuelson. I'm a lawyer in private practice in Fort Collins. I'm not currently involved in any death penalty cases, but as recently as 6 years ago, I was involved in a capital case, and I'd like to share that experience with you. Like everyone else on the panel, this is not an academic discussion for me. This is something that has touched my life. This issue has touched some of our lives as crime victims, as prosecutors, and me as a defense lawyer. And I think a big part of this important discussion has to focus on whether the death penalty is being uniformly and fairly applied across the state. And in answering that question, I think my experience perhaps shed some light, a different perspective in this discussion. So, 6 years ago, I was a member of the Public Defender's Office, as I said, based in Fort Collins, but I was assigned to a capital case out of the 18th Judicial District. The 18th Judicial District not only consists of Douglas County and Arapahoe County metro jurisdictions, you also have the counties of Elbert and Lincoln, and in Lincoln County is Lyman Correctional Facility. My client, David Bueno, was in prison at the time for an unrelated crime, serving a long sentence, and he was accused of killing another inmate who DOC, or prison investigators, had identified as a white supremacist. The prosecution's theory was that David Bueno and his co-defendant, a man by the name of Alejandro Perez, who were members of a Hispanic prison gang, that they had crossed the racial lines and committed this retaliatory murder against a white supremacist inmate. In support of that, they built a case largely based on prison informant testimony. One of the main witnesses in support of the prosecution theory was long ago identified as the vice president of the Aryan Brotherhood. Another one of the main informant witnesses in the case went by the prison moniker Crooked, and it was largely based on informant testimony that the case against Alejandro Perez and David Bueno was built. There was some physical evidence, and the first piece of physical evidence that was collected in the case and then later introduced at trial was an anonymous note. And that anonymous note read, "Killers, Bueno and Perez." And as was never disputed at trial, it was on the basis of that anonymous note that prison investigators focused their investigation on Mr. Bueno and Mr. Perez. Our theory of defense, on the other hand, was that this was a murder that was carried out by white supremacists, that they were trying to effectively clean up their ranks, that they killed one of their own and then framed two Hispanic, basically patsies. The case went to trial, and just like all of the cases you've already heard about, months were consumed in jury selection, and then weeks and weeks and weeks during the presentation of the evidence. And our theory was openly mocked by the prosecution. It was, in their closing arguments, labeled as speculative, ridiculous. I think it was even called nothing more than a case built on parlor tricks. The jury ultimately convicted David Bueno of first-degree murder after 3.5 days of deliberations, and so the case proceeded on to the sentencing phase, and only by the narrowest of margins did David Bueno escape a death sentence. He received life without the possibility of parole, and everyone involved in the case packed up and went home. I went home to my family in Fort Collins, and quite honestly, hope to move on with my life and forget about that experience, because it was so tolling for everyone involved, the lawyers, the victim's family, everyone involved, including the prison guards, the judge, the prosecutors. then something unexpected happened. As you heard when Susan was making her introductory remarks, the co-defendant begins litigating their case in earnest. And through that pretrial litigation, I guess by chance or fate, better lawyering, whatever you want to call it, it was discovered that there wasn't just one note that was found by DOC officials immediately after the homicide. It turns out there were two. And that second note, it didn't identify Bueno and Perez as the killers. Rather, it was a note that was purportedly written by white supremacists that said some sort of proclamation, we are going to clean up the ranks of our fellow white brotherhood, and it listed names. Said these folks are next. This isn't the last killing. You haven't heard the last of us, and that's not verbatim, but that's the main gist of the note. But it wasn't just a second note that was found. There was also apparently a second body, and when they came off a lockdown, because when someone is killed in a prison, the first thing that, of course, has to occur is the threat has to be contained, and the crime scene, as best as possible in a prison, has to be preserved. So for 3 days they're on lockdown. They come off a lockdown, and now one of the guys, a white inmate who was named as one of the targets on the hit list, has serious injuries on his chest and is almost dead. They take him to the local hospital in Hugo. They do a flight for life to Denver, and he dies. So it's a second note, a second body, and then it turns out there was a second parallel investigation done by DOC investigators where they tried to link the two homicides to the white supremacist suspects. Now, I'm always dubious when people make claims about this evidence would have made a big difference in the case. The only thing I would point out is that with the benefit of this additional evidence, our co-defendant went to trial on largely the same evidence, again, with the exception of the second note, the second body, and the second investigation, and within 4 hours is found not guilty of any crime. In our case, of course, this discovery of evidence that bred post-conviction litigation. Our judge, the trial judge, Douglas Tallman, found that substantial exculpatory evidence had been withheld by the prosecution, and he found that it was a deliberate effort. And then he took what I believe in Colorado is an unprecedented step in a first-degree murder death penalty case and vacated the conviction. The 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office then appealed. The case went up to the Colorado Court of Appeals, and in November, the Court of Appeals upheld Judge Tallman and said, yes, the conviction should have been tossed. We affirm this decision. What happened to Mr. Bueno effectively denied him a fair trial when his life was on the line. The case has since been appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court, where it's currently under consideration. And I share my experience about the Bueno and Perez case because since I was involved in that case now 6 years ago, I've heard many times people argue that it couldn't happen in Colorado. An innocent person could not end up on death row. An innocent person couldn't be convicted. We've got appointed judges who are independent. We've got very good and ethical prosecutors. We've got zealous defense lawyers. And the procedural safeguards are in place to make sure that an innocent is never executed. And I would like to believe that the David Bueno case is illustrative that, yes, it can happen here. And the only way to ensure that it doesn't is to abolish the death penalty in Colorado.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask some questions and leave them open-ended for all of you. For each of you, some of you are just involved in, have one case that you're involved with. Obviously, you, Mr. Young, have had several. But these very personal incidents, these very private, personal deaths of people become political instantly when death is at stake or when someone's life is at stake. Bob, your son's murder opened up a whole conversation about Lyman Correctional Facility, the way it was managed, what was going on at the time of his murder, understaffing, and a general sense of what some people call a thunderdome, just a place totally out of control. So it opened up, it was this personal thing for you, and it opened up a whole can of worms that I think will become much more public as the trial continues. Dave, you must have dealt with many, many victims who, in an instant, are thrust into this very public judicial process. It must be very foreign to them. Representative Fields, 9 years after your son and Vivian's death, there's a legal battle now about efforts to unseal the trial transcripts and other documents in the case. It's 9 years after the incident, several years after the trials, and all the documents are sealed. And there's concern, largely because of what Derek said, that there's concern in the community that if we're going to have a death penalty, we want to make sure that it was done right. And there were things done in that case that some opponents of the death penalty would like to examine for possible prosecutorial misconduct. So this case lives on in court long after you're really involved. And then, Derek, just that I think anyone can listen to you and know kind of imagine what it's like to pack up and live somewhere else for 3 months after you've been working on a case for probably a year or two. It takes you away from your family, it takes you away from your life, and you become the voice for someone who essentially has no voice. So I just open the question up to all of you. This is obviously a political issue. Is it a partisan issue? Has it become too political? What do you have to say about that?
Well, in my son's case, it's become very political, even to the point of leaving the justice behind and just for political reasons pursuing this death penalty. Numerous times people have been exonerated from death row. We know that. We don't know how many innocent people were killed in all these death penalties here in Colorado, but one is too many. One innocent person is too many. And in my opinion, the life in prison is a much harsher penalty than death. Death is actually a way out for some of these inmates. There's 5 individuals in Washington State that are wanting to be killed because they received the death penalty. And sure, it's an easy out for them. I mean, they don't have much of a life where they're at, and they figure I'm better off dead. And so by helping them, we're just doing what they wanted, and to me, that isn't right either. So regarding the numerous mistakes that have been made in the past, and I'm sure they've got it right in some cases, and my case is a little bit different because it happened in a correctional facility, and there was numerous the situation was mismanaged so many times by the Department of Corrections in the state of Colorado, but yet none of this was brought to the court. And so I'm thinking, well, how can we kill this man if there is no justice for everybody involved? And so, and because of my experience as a prison guard, I've seen some of the things that go on in prison, and I really do believe that the harsher sentence is life in prison. And if it's revenge you're seeking, and if it's out of anger, that is a more powerful statement than to kill him early, in my opinion.
Well, in answer to your question, I do not think the decision to seek death is a political decision. And when I started out telling you I'm not a politician, and I don't want to open a can of worms here, but in Colorado, we're the only state in the country that has term limits for prosecutors. And it opens that door for people to use the role of a district attorney as a stepping stone to go on to other political advances. And then when you have that, you get the perception that decisions that district attorney makes are political. And so that's a side issue to what we're talking about here. I think it's important to know, and I'll give you my perspective of what I look at in a death penalty case and a decision to seek a death penalty case. And I'm not familiar with the facts of the Bueno case, so I can't really comment on what's going there. But in my experience, the first thing I look at is ID. If you have any doubt whatsoever that the person didn't commit the crime, death is not going to be on the table. Okay? The death penalty cases I prosecuted, it wasn't a whodunit. It was more of a why they did it. It turned into a mental defense. And were they capable of forming the mental states associated with first-degree murder, or were they mentally capable of being executed under the death penalty statutes? That's what the issues were. So the issues, in fact, in the Salmon and Wolk cases, the juries were out 5 minutes. So the guilt or innocent wasn't an issue. They weren't standing in court saying you got the wrong guy. It was more of there's mental disabilities here. So that's the first factor. In Colorado, we have a 4-step process in seeking the death penalty. The first and most important step is there an aggravator beyond a reasonable doubt? And there's several aggravators in the statute. The aggravators that I look at personally are the cruel and heinous nature of the case, how many victims there were, the victim's stature in the community, a witness, a Department of Correction officer, a judge, a prosecutor. They're murdered because someone else was facing perhaps a life sentence in a murder trial, and you seek death because of the nature of the victim. Okay? There's more, but those are what I can think of at the top of my head. The next step, if you get beyond that and say, I do have at least one aggravator that I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, you look and see what other aggravators there are. But then you also have to look at the mitigation. And you look and see whether or not the defendant was intoxicated. You look and see whether or not the defendant had any mental illnesses. And a lot of times you don't find out about those until you actually call the defense attorney and say, and I've done this on several cases, I'm considering seeking the maximum penalty in this case. I would like to give you an opportunity to come talk to me and let me know what mitigation evidence you have in helping me make that decision. And that's happened in every case that I've had. It happens in the cases that I went to trial on the death penalty cases. I can give you an example of a case that I had up in Adams County when I just recently went up there from Colorado Springs back in 2005, and it's a Damon Arguello case. Damon Arguello killed his wife and his very young baby. Brutal murder. Again, I don't like getting into the details of these murders. But it was certainly, the aggravation was there. The aggravation outweighed the mitigation. Don Quick was the district attorney at the time. The case was assigned to me. We had several discussions about, is this the case we want to seek the death penalty on? We had the defense attorneys come in from the public defender's office and say, we're thinking about seeking death. We consulted with the family. And when they came in and talked to us, they were telling us about some mitigation. But during that conversation, they said, my client's willing to plead to 2 life sentences. And so that changes things, okay? And so as a prosecutor, I'm obligated to talk to the family about that and give them the options. If we go death, it's going to be 3 years of litigation. We're going to have appeals after that, and so forth and so forth. And we look at the facts and say, is this a death penalty case? In that particular case, it was, in my opinion. But there was something else that we had to consider. The witnesses. Because you see, in this particular case, there was 2, a young son and a young daughter, both under the age of 12, who witnessed this brutal murder. And so we had to consider, what would they have to go through if we went through a death penalty trial? And how would that affect their lives? And so we had many conversations with the victim's family. At the end of the day, we felt that justice was 2 consecutive life sentences for him. And it wasn't because the mitigation outweighed the aggravation. It was because, how much do you want to victimize those 2 young children? And that's what prosecutors do. I just had a case last year as an elected DA, very similar situation. It was a 14-year-old who was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. Defendant was severely intoxicated. I brought the public defenders over to my office, and I said, what mitigation do you have? And they told me things I had already known, but at the end of the day, I made a decision of what is going to happen. What's the likelihood of seeking or receiving a death sentence in this case? We had the aggravation, we had some mitigation. I consulted with the family and made the decision that in this case, an 80-year sentence was appropriate, which is going to turn out to be a life sentence for that defendant. And so really, when we debate the death penalty and we bring up cases, it's really on a case-by-case basis. I know that I've been consulted by Mr. Brockler on some of the cases he has going on now. We reach out to other district attorneys to consult with them before we make this serious decision. And we put a lot of thought and time and effort into it. But the way I operate, I give a lot of weight to what the victims want to do, and I'm honest with them. It's going to be a long time, and then even if we get a conviction and death sentence, it's not over then. So in the 3 cases that I went to trial, all the victims were on board with it, and they were willing to go through with it because of what happened to their daughter. I hope I answered your question the best I could.
Thank you.
You bet.
Try this one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So for me, I don't think it's political. The way I kind of see the death penalty right now, it's the law. It's the law. And the last time there was a ballot measure, and it asked the people of Colorado, should we repeal the death penalty or should we keep it on the books? And the people of Colorado said that we want to have the death penalty on the books as an option, as a tool for DAs to use if they felt like it merited all the elements to be a death penalty case. So for me, it's not about if it's political. It's the law in the state of Colorado. And the only way to change that is 2 ways. Another ballot measure where it goes to the people, and the people will say, yes, I support it, I want it repealed, or yes, I want to keep it on the books. It's as simple as that. That happened this last session where there was a bill to repeal the death penalty. It failed. I ran a bill saying that decision shouldn't be made by the 100 elected officials down at the state capitol. That should be left up to the people of Colorado because it's that important for our state to be involved and engaged in what should be the maximum sentence that's allowable. So for me, it was about premeditated murder. It wasn't about being angry. It's not about being revengeful. It was about seeking justice in the honor and the memory of my son, whose life was taken far too short. But I can tell you, it wasn't an easy decision to pursue the death penalty. I am a daughter. I am a mother, a grandmother. I'm a woman of faith. And it's not easy. And I've seen how it has taken a toll, even on the prosecutors, because it is all absorbing. But they were committed, because once we all decided that we had consensus around moving forward with the death penalty, it wasn't time to, act indecisive and we're not going to move in this direction. Once we decided that we were all in, we're all in. And I got in with my eyes wide open. And when I say that, I was advised. I mean, it still was the DA's decision to make the decision. But I was told that it's going to take a long time. So when I see information in the newspaper, I was told way in advance, this is what it looks like. And we already had some history or background based on the Dunlap case, knowing how long that was taken. So despite all the information that was available to me, I supported the DA's decision to pursue the death penalty on behalf of my son and his fiancée.
You were asking about whether this is political.
Or is it partisan?
I guess to tackle the political issue first, Dave was describing the process by which he vets potential first-degree murder cases for the appropriateness of pursuing the death penalty, and he describes a very apolitical process. But I don't think that's the way it always works in every jurisdiction in Colorado, and that certainly wasn't my experience. I have practiced in a lot of places. I actually grew up in Arapahoe County, so I feel like I still have the lay of the land of the 18th Judicial District. But I've practiced all over eastern Colorado and Weld County and Larimer County, and also in Denver, where I started my career as a young deputy public defender. And I think that it very much can become a political game. You have these terrible crimes, and there is an incredible amount of pressure brought to bear by the public to solve these crimes and to deal with them harshly. And by the time you get to court, the sides are so dug in their positions that it just becomes almost like for lack of a better description, a knife fight in the dark. And these win at all costs prosecutions and defenses, in my experience, do not further the truth-seeking mission of the justice system. And they lead, not every time, but as you heard Mr. Otterby say, one time is too many. They lead to miscarriages of justice. Is it a partisan issue? I don't think it's a partisan issue. It's no secret that in the public defender, you're going to find far more Democrats than Republicans. I don't think I just gave anything away. But I don't think it's partisan because, you look at who serves on juries. And you don't get on capital jury unless you've been through the death qualification process, which means that you can seriously consider imposing a death penalty. Yet in our experience, and I'll tell you, we're out in Lincoln County, Colorado, which is probably closer to the Oklahoma line than it is to where we sit today. And you have a very conservative constituency. And on our jury, you had, I mean, if you were going to take a poll, I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Democrat. But I don't think that the Democrats or the Republicans have the market cornered on, you know, the ultimate issue of who should live and who should die. And the foreman in our case was, I think, had previously served as a town mayor. And you don't get elected in Lyman as a Democrat. And you know, for him, it was not a partisan issue. None of the jurors that we interviewed afterwards described this as having anything to do with political ideology. For most, it had to do with morality. And I think morality has little or nothing to do with politics. But yes, I do think that when you have these big cases, the sides become galvanized, and it does become unfortunately, in my experience, a political process.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one quick question of Bob and Representative Fields before opening questions to the audience. In your case, if an execution were to be carried out, how do you imagine that would feel?
You know, I haven't given that any thought in reference to how that will feel. I can tell you right now, my heart is broken. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my son. And I don't go around thinking about what it will feel like when and if or ever he's executed. I think about my son. I think about his promise in what he could have been in this world. I don't spend time thinking about what it's going to feel like for him, because I'm still trying to deal with what it feels like for me to live my life as a mother who's lost their son in the hands of someone else. I have a daughter, and I have grandchildren, and a circle of family and friends. We all love Javad very, very deeply, and we're saddened by what has happened. And so my energy and my efforts has been focused on trying to look and do good. So I ran for office, and I run public policy. In fact, as a citizen, one of the very first bill I ran was a bill that's now named after my son, the Javad Marshall Fields and Vivian Wolf Witness Protection Bill. Basically to make sure that anyone who finds themselves in the position where they're going to be a witness, there is now a protocol that's used where they evaluate the level of risk so that someone can have a safety plan in place. So I spend my time looking to correct injustices that I see around my community and just where I'm at. And so I spend very little time thinking about what that might feel like.
Thank you. Bob, you've spent some time recently with Edward Montour, and I know you discussed the possibility, what might happen if he were to be sentenced to death and if an execution were to be carried out. Can you talk about that?
Yes, we discussed several things. I told Montour, because I didn't think this was a fair trial, that I would be at his side if they were to put him down. For the fact that it's not about justice, what's going on in my son's case. And I too think about my son every day, all day. And I know my son was about life and loving and caring. And so I want to make something positive out of his death. I mean, this is the most negative thing that's ever happened in my life. But I have the opportunity to make something positive out of it. And if it takes all of my being, that's what I'll do. I've had a lot of comments from strangers on how my forgiving has helped them to forgive. And I've met with several victims, family members, and they're looking for peace as well. And I'm trying to help them in any way that I can. But earlier we mentioned how the death penalty, the people of Colorado voted for it. Most people don't have a clue what the death penalty involves. You know, it's this macho crap that let's kill him, let's kill him. That's the first knee-jerk reaction to a death. And by doing that, we become them. By wanting to kill back, we become the murderers. And that would not make my son happy. That would not make me happy. And that would not make my God happy. And all this discussion, nobody talks about God and what God would want us to do. You know, on the almighty dollar it says, "In God we trust." The Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. We don't even listen to what God has to say about this thing. We put it in the hands of man, and we've seen what a great job man has done to this point. The Bible has been around for 2,000 years and is still relevant. And we've been doing this for 200 years and we think we have all the answers. The reality is we don't know crap. You know, unless we turn to God, we can leave it to man, but man hasn't shown me anything really. Man law, only through this experience was able to recognize this. And so we've all made mistakes. And I told Edward, I says, there's two ways you're going to leave here. You're going to leave here dead, or you're going to spend the rest of your life here, but you have two options. You could find your way back to God and ask for forgiveness. And that's what he told me he was going to do. And I believed him because I looked him straight in the eye when we discussed this. Now the other way, if you continue to have this hate in you that wants to hurt people, then you're going to be living your own living hell until you die. Life in prison is a death sentence. But in the meantime, you get to think about what you did, and you're going to pay the ultimate cost, not with your life, but with your suffering and your the terrible things that you've done. And so I think we need to consider what God would do in this case. Because we're in a house of God right now. And I find it hard to believe that we're discussing killing people in the house of God. I don't feel comfortable with that, but it is what it is. And so, with that being said, I'll turn it over to someone else.
Keep your microphone there. So
Okay.
people will want to ask you questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Ernest Goodolay. I have a couple of observations. First of all, Representative Fields, Mr. Otterby, you have my deepest sympathy. I certainly can't put myself in your shoes, but as close as I can be, my heart breaks for you. I have a personal history that goes all the way back to Bob Mungy, which was the first person executed, or the last person executed before Gary Davis. My brother was in Canyon City when that happened. I witnessed Gary Davis's execution. Mr. Young, I would address my first comment to you, and I think that you're dancing on the semantic head of a pin when you separate prosecutor from politician, because I think the two go hand in hand. I wonder, the question has been asked before, which strawberry gave you the rash? As a reporter, I covered scores of homicides, not only in Denver, but all over the country. As you sit around talking with reporters, you can ask, have you covered any bad crimes? And to a person, one homicide will top the other. So the examples you gave, however heinous and painful to listen to, the result is still death. The person who committed the crime is still something below animals. Mrs. Fields, pardon me, Representative Fields, when you talk about the law is the law and these decisions about the law should be made by the electorate as opposed to the legislature, I'm not sure that I would agree with that, particularly as it applies to things like slavery. Majority rules isn't a very comfortable outcome, but it's democracy. So I would take issue with that. And I also have, and please forgive me for, I don't mean to dominate this, but this is a very emotional thing because I think state-sanctioned homicide is an immoral act. And Mr. Young, when I was witnessing Gary Davis's execution, it was very political because at the end of it, and I was reminded because I heard Bob Grant talking on NPR just a couple of days ago, and he was very thoughtful and very touching, and he was very emotional, and he said, I didn't want to see anybody suffer. The fact of the matter is, he was high-fiving in the row behind me when Gary Davis died, and he was high-fiving with the relatives of Gary Davis's victim. That was not being a prosecutor, that was being a man of the people. So I question the separation there. But in sum, because as I said, I don't want to dominate everything, I just think that when the state takes it upon itself to commit homicide, however sanitized the words or the statute make it seem, you are still taking the life of a human being. And how you can live with yourself for taking the life of another human being makes you as much a part of the problem as the person that was prosecuted. And believe me, Representative Fields, Mr. Otterby, I have a heart full of sympathy for you, and I realize that doesn't change anything. But I think we all came here tonight with our own preconceived notions, and listening to you kind of underscored mine. I'm opposed to the death penalty today, tomorrow, and forever. We cannot, as a society, continue to kill our own and expect the outcome to make us better. And one last thing. You were talking about victims. When I met Gary Davis's daughter, she was not the brightest light in the chandelier, but the fact of the matter is, she said something very simple. She said, "What did I do? I'm going to be a victim." So, thank you very much.
I just have a very quick question, which is the three men who are on death row in Colorado are all of African American heritage. The statistics, as I understand them, is that there is a disproportionate number of people of color who are on death row that doesn't reflect the number of people who have committed heinous crimes. So I'm a little surprised that this panel has overlooked that, and I'd be interested in your views about that.
I can tell you that the cases that I prosecuted death penalty, Lucas Salmon was Caucasian, George Wolt was Caucasian, Anthony Jimenez was Hispanic. I don't look at the race when I look at filing any criminal charges. Sometimes I don't even look at the name unless ID is an issue. You look at the facts, you file cases based on the facts. And that's what prosecutors do with regards to, at least I can only speak for myself, okay? I don't look at race, color, gender at all.
But in Colorado, these three men are in a judicial district where the DA is running specifically on the death penalty. And the notion that Colorado voters should be the ones to vote. I think that's a pass on a legislative responsibility. We elect legislators to make those tough decisions, and perhaps you don't have the vote to overturn it. So if you go to I'm going to stop.
Can I address that?
It takes a lot to get Seal to stop. Please.
You know, I don't think that it's, thank you, open to any serious dispute that there's a huge racial disparity when it comes to the application of the death penalty, not just nationwide, but in Colorado. I was doing some research on this before I came over here. 21 of the last 23 cases in Colorado where the death penalty was sought were against men of color. And I think at a certain point, the statistics speak for themselves. And, it's not by coincidence that the lion's share of the death penalty prosecutions come out of the 18th Judicial District. That is a priority of that district attorney's office. And I think it is a political issue. And it undermines the fundamental concept of the criminal justice system that the citizens of Colorado ought to be treated the same whether you live in Trinidad or whether you live in Fort Collins or Grand Junction. And you have these very random basis upon which death penalty prosecutions are often sought. I mean, depending on what side of the county line the crime occurred may determine whether the death penalty is sought. If it's in Denver, probably not. Arapahoe County, game on. So I don't think that is subject to any real debate or dispute because the statistics speak for themselves.
Well, the three men that are on death row are all three African Americans. No question about that. But the reason that the death penalty was sought against all three of them had nothing to do with their race. It had to do with their crime. We all have opinions. I'm expressing mine. So in my view, it's about the crime. And with my son's murder, he's African American. She was biracial. And that crime that was committed against my son and his fiancée was about murder and the circumstances of that event. It had nothing to do with the race of Robert Ray and Somario Owens. It was the element of the crime. He killed a witness. My son was ambushed. Now, I would want to believe, and I do believe this, if the offender was white and the same crime happened against my son, I would still expect the prosecutor to do the same procedures and everything that came about with my case. That I would be consulted, and race never came up. So I believe in my heart, like what you're saying, is that race has, all three of them are black, and they committed horrible crimes. Dunlap, 5 people. Robert Ray Somario Owens, if you count it up, it's 3. And right now, standing in trial in Aurora, you have James Holmes, who killed 12 and injured 58. And they're seeking the death penalty for him. I don't know if they're going to get it based on his mental condition. But for me, it's not about race. It's about the crime, and it's about if you're guilty or not.
I would like to say that if we didn't have the death penalty, this wouldn't even be an issue. We wouldn't be here right now. And so the death penalty is what ties all this together and creates all these doubts in all of our minds. But without the death penalty, we don't have to worry about that. And so that's one more reason to get rid of it.
Quick question. Are you related to Edward Montour?
No, no relation. No, just human. We're in the same human race, I believe.
There's been a lot of talk that you're related.
No, no.
Question.
This story may be a little long. It's actually somewhat emotional. October 12th, 2008. I got a call I'll never forget. Not far from here, many people that live in the hood remember the Crookham murder. I was scheduled to make dinner that night with Tom Crookham. He calls me. He tells me his 2-year-old son was killed, shot in his arms. I knew that child was dead before the father. I'll never forget comforting the father in Denver General. 60 days later, to the date, my friend Tim Minnick, who represents Mr. Young, you prosecuted his murderers this month, was killed at the Grizzly Rose. I will fully agree with Representative Fields that not all crimes are equal. Let's fast forward ahead. Let's talk about Aurora. Let's talk about James Holmes. Recently, I took my girlfriend to the theater. I thought about what he did. I sat in those chairs. I thought about what the people went through. I saw the resident evil in it. I struggle with the death penalty, but I want to hear solutions to where things such as the dire consequences that Representative Fields face every day for people doing, that what the Aurora murder doing, what's an alternative to the death penalty that will be more than life in prison? What can we as a society set aside for the worst of the worst?
If I could answer that, I was a correction officer, and Edward Montour, when he allegedly killed his daughter, was placed in maximum security, but that only lasted for a couple of years. The trouble with that situation was they put him in a position to hurt my son. And the DOC has been failing in the way they do their business by the number of inmates that are being killed. I believe there's 40 or 50 in the last 20 years, inmates that have been killed. And then the 2 officers, and then Director Tom Clements. And if the state were to have a better way of dealing with these individuals, Montour was willing to accept maximum security, administrative sake for the rest of his life to be held accountable for my son's death. And if that were the case with Owens or Ray or whoever these individuals were, that would be punishment. But the state, in their infinite wisdom, puts them away for a little while and then sends them out to play again. And then you have more incidents in the prison. And I think the failure is in our penal system, and as well as the judicial system. And there's got to be a lot more work done. Just to kill Montour is not going to solve the issues in the prison where more people continue to die. That's not going to solve anything. More people will continue to die because they refuse to change the way they do their business. And so we as citizens, we have to put the pressure on the penal system to hold these individuals more accountable. A life in a medium security prison is a cakewalk. High school kids laugh at life in a medium security facility. It's a spa, it's Club Med in their eyes. They actually brag about doing time in a medium security facility. But you put that individual in that seg, and if he's a young person and he's going to spend the rest of his life there, he's going to think twice about it, in my opinion.
I would like to make a short statement, and if you would respond to it. The moral values of our society are well expressed in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which I'll abbreviate. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all are created equal. Contemplating equality, which there's no adjective in front of it, I would say moral equality. We're not talking about mathematical equality. I suppose that means an inherent equal worth of the basic being of every person, no matter their beliefs, attitudes, or practices, or in other words, an unconditional respect for the intrinsic equal value of every person. I suppose that the torture and the death penalty violate that basic principle. And would you just comment on that? I can go with that. Thank you.
Our forefathers also mentioned in the Constitution that thou shalt not take a life without due process. That's in there. And that's in there for a reason. And that's when I talked about due process when this first thing started, that's what I'm talking about. The due process that is afforded anybody who's seeking or is being sought after the most serious offense in the state of Colorado, the maximum penalty of the death penalty, is extremely high. There is evil out there. I've seen it. There are people who kill for fun and that will kill again because it's fun. Those people need to be treated differently than others because they will kill again. In Colorado, we have a Make My Day law that justifies killing someone who's breaking into your house if you fear that they're going to come in to commit a crime. We have self-defense in Colorado. If you're in fear of seriously bodily injury or death, you can use deadly physical force to kill somebody. I am glad that we have this diversity in Colorado, and we can talk about the morality of the death penalty. But as a prosecutor, we have the death penalty in the state of Colorado. I take an oath to follow the law in the state of Colorado. There are cases in the state of Colorado that warrant the maximum sentence.
I'd like to speak on that. Anyway, people talk to me about the death penalty and they say, oh, an eye for an eye, an eye for an eye. There is no way that I could compare Montour's life to the value of my son's life. Because my son was doing good, as Rhonda's son was doing good, and to say that by taking their life, it's going to make some kind of equality, that's an outrageous lie. Because to take the life of a killer as opposed to a good person, there is no comparison. But they all deserve God's grace. They all deserve to have a chance to find their way back. And that's what we would hope would happen. And if not, they'll live in their own self-made hell for the rest of their lives. And if that's what they want, then that's what they deserve.
And picking up on Ms. Rodney's point, I just don't think there are cases where there is a social cost, no doubt. The criminal justice system can never make things right. It can never make up for these terrible losses. And I don't pretend to speak for someone who suffered that life-changing loss, but I do appreciate Mr. Otteby's comments that we don't adopt the moral code of the killers as a society. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it does come down to the sanctity of life and the decision on how we deal with the worst of the worst cases, which, by the way, I got to tell you, I think Dave has probably handled twice as many cases, murder cases, as I have. But the murder cases that I've handled, by no way, no stretch of the imagination when I say that David Bueno is anywhere near the worst of the worst cases, yet he was selected for death penalty prosecution. But at the end of the day, there are certain things that the criminal justice system is not going to ever make equal or make right. Victims, unfortunately, cannot be brought back, but a person can be put away. And if they are that awful person that has been described here at length, they can be put in a cell for a 23-hour lockdown where they never pose a threat to anyone else. The threat is neutralized. They live a miserable life where they have to think about what they've done for the rest of their life, and they will never breathe a free breath ever again, and they will die on God's time.
Representative Fields, you have the last word, if you'd like it.
Are we doing closing remarks?
No, just if you'd like to respond to his question. That was the last question, and do you have anything to say? No. What do you see happening in this statewide conversation that we're supposed to be having in the next year or two?
On this topic?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, the status is status quo right now. So right now in the state of Colorado, the death penalty is on the books, and that's the law. That's the maximum sentence that's allowed in the state of Colorado. So the death penalty is the law here. And so the way that's going to be changed is either through the legislature or through a ballot initiative. As you all know, Governor Hickenlooper granted a reprieve for Nathan Dunlap, which means he will stay on death row, and he's left that decision up to the next governor. I'm quite sure Governor Hickenlooper will be reelected for another 4 more years, and I don't know if we'll ever see Nathan Dunlap be executed. I don't know. But I expect for things to be status quo for the next 2 years, and we'll see what happens.
I want to thank you all for coming today and talking about a very tender topic, especially to both of you parents. And Dave and Derek, thank you for sitting together at a table. I think that's progress. So thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. We are going to wrap this up, but we have some refreshments kind of around the corner near where you came in, the front entrance, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you.